The wind howled through the barren branches of the trees as darkness blanketed the quiet suburban neighborhood. On a street where families had grown old together, one house stood apart, its silhouette shrouded in mystery, hidden by the heavy smoke billowing into the night sky. It had once been a symbol of comfort, a place where warmth and laughter echoed through its walls. Now, it was nothing more than a skeleton, charred beyond recognition, sitting like a cursed relic amidst the quiet. As the clock neared midnight, no one saw the disaster unfolding. It wasn't until the fire erupted in a thunderous explosion that the panic began. Windows shattered. Glass rained down like glittering knives onto the cracked pavement below. The first wail of sirens pierced the air, followed by the sight of flashing red and blue lights that illuminated the street, casting strange shadows on the charred ruins. Firefighters arrived quickly, but the flames had already claimed everything. The house, located in a modest neighborhood, was swallowed whole. A fire so fierce that even the bravest souls hesitated. By the time the trucks pulled up to the scene, the fire had ravaged the walls, destroyed the roof, and left nothing but an ominous glow against the night sky. The heat was unbearable as the team began their efforts, but all they found inside was devastation. Among the wreckage, the only thing that remained was the smell, an overwhelming stench of burnt wood, melted plastic, and the acrid scent of tragedy. But the bodies, 2 of them, were gone, nowhere to be found amidst the embers. At first, there was no way to tell who had been inside. The fire had consumed everything. But when the firemen dug through the smoldering rubble, a scream escaped the lips of one of the officers. Beneath the broken floorboards, half buried under what remained of the kitchen, was the body of a woman, scorched beyond recognition. The victim's name was Emily Bradford. She was the heart of the neighborhood, a mother, a wife, a woman who volunteered at the local shelter, a teacher at the elementary school. Emily was known for her kindness, her willingness to help anyone in need. Her family, husband Greg, and their 2 children, were adored by everyone. How could such a tragic fate befall someone so beloved? But the fire, this wasn't an accident. At least not the kind everyone expected. Detective James Harlow stood at the scene, eyes scanning the area as a sense of unease crept into his gut. He'd seen his share of fires, accidental ones, the kind that came from faulty wiring, gas leaks, or the occasional careless smoker. But this didn't feel like an accident. The fire had burned too evenly, too deliberately. The damage was methodical, as though someone had carefully planned this destruction. "James, come over here," one of the firefighters called, snapping Harlow from his thoughts. Harlow walked over to the remains of the living room, where the damage was even worse. The walls had collapsed inward, and charred furniture lay in heaps like broken skeletons. Among the wreckage was an odd, yet unmistakable detail, a small, blackened piece of fabric caught on a metal beam. It was strange, almost out of place. He knelt down to examine it, his gloved fingers carefully brushing away the ash. It was a sleeve, dark, embroidered, and singed at the edges. But it wasn't a typical piece of clothing one might find in a family home. This was a man's sleeve. And it didn't belong to Greg Bradford. "Who does this belong to?" Harlow muttered under his breath. His instincts kicked in. The fabric didn't match the rest of the household's belongings. The sleeve, dark, crisp, and expertly torn, was a sign. Someone had been inside the house long before the fire started. He pulled out his phone and immediately contacted his team. "I want a full report on Greg Bradford. I don't care if he's the victim's husband, find everything you can on him." As the team scoured through the charred remnants of the house, a pattern began to form, one that revealed an ugly truth no one had wanted to admit. Greg Bradford was nowhere to be found. The children, both of them, were missing as well. Their whereabouts? Unexplained. An eerie silence filled the air, each question hanging in the space like an unfinished sentence. Harlow stood still for a moment, contemplating. He had one thought running through his mind: this fire wasn't just a tragic accident. Emily's death had been planned. But by whom? Days passed, and the investigation began to unravel a deeper, darker truth. It seemed too surreal to be real. Emily had been murdered. There was no other way to explain it. Greg Bradford had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to the fire. Neighbors had reported odd behavior, a sense of tension that hung around him like a cloud. The family had been struggling financially, and there were rumors that Emily had recently discovered her husband's affair. But that alone didn't seem like enough to drive someone to murder. Or did it? The more Harlow dug into the Bradfords' history, the more twisted the story became. Emily had been a devoted mother, a supportive wife, yet Greg had secrets. A secret life full of debts, stolen money, and hidden relationships that had slowly eaten away at the heart of the family. Emily, though hurt by Greg's betrayal, had decided to confront him about it just days before the fire. That conversation had led to a vicious argument, one that ended with her accusing him of stealing from her, hiding assets, and lying to her for years. In a fit of rage, Greg swore he'd never let her tear their family apart. That was the breaking point. The moment Greg decided to destroy it all. Harlow found the proof he needed when he located a hidden stash of matches and gasoline in Greg's truck, parked a few blocks away from the scene. The gasoline had been poured around the house in specific places, strategically set up to ensure that the fire would spread quickly and efficiently, leaving no chance for survival. Greg had started the fire. But why did he let his wife die? Why didn't he save her? Was it guilt, a momentary lapse in his conscience? Or had he intended for it all to happen? As Harlow pondered these questions, his phone rang. "Detective Harlow," a voice asked. "We've found something in Greg Bradford's personal records. You need to see this." Harlow met the informant at the station, where he was handed a folder containing the latest findings. Inside was a series of phone records, detailing calls made between Greg Bradford and a mysterious number. The calls started a week before the fire, and they were frequent, sometimes several in a single day. Harlow's eyes narrowed as he scanned the records. The number traced back to someone Greg knew well, a former friend named Caleb Dawson, someone with a criminal record. As Harlow dove deeper into Caleb's past, a chilling discovery was made. Caleb was a known arsonist, someone who had served time for multiple fires he had set in the past. It became clear Greg Bradford had been in league with Caleb all along. The fire had not been a simple act of revenge, it had been planned in cold, calculated detail. Greg had paid Caleb to carry out the deed, to make sure that Emily would never get the life she deserved. His anger, jealousy, and betrayal had boiled over into something lethal, and now, the consequences were becoming painfully clear. It's clear now, this was no accident. But what drives a man to destroy everything he once loved? Could this betrayal be the catalyst for something far darker than we realize? Stay tuned, because we're just getting started. Hit that subscribe button and follow along as we dive deeper into the twisted mind behind this heinous crime. What happened to the children? What role did Caleb play? And is Greg Bradford truly the mastermind behind it all? The investigation took an unexpected turn. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, an unlikely suspect emerged, an estranged relative with a murky past and a tangled web of secrets. No one saw it coming. What was once assumed to be a straightforward case of arson, revenge, and betrayal suddenly unraveled into something far more complex. The scent of stale coffee filled the air as Detective Harlow sat in his office, his eyes scanning the documents before him. He had always known that a case like this would have layers, unpredictable twists and turns, but he didn't expect the next revelation to come from someone so close to the Bradfords. It was the quietest leads that often held the most weight, he reminded himself. Greg Bradford had been the prime suspect since the fire, everything pointed to him. But as Harlow reviewed the evidence, a gnawing feeling told him something didn't add up. He had learned that Greg's former friend, Caleb Dawson, had a history of setting fires, some of them arson for insurance money, but this wasn't the first time Caleb had been involved in a deadly incident. The more Harlow dug into Caleb's life, the more unsettling facts surfaced. Caleb wasn't just an arsonist, he was an expert manipulator, someone who could twist the truth, frame people, and disappear into the shadows. But there was something else, something even more shocking, hidden within Greg's family. Harlow's gut told him to focus on Greg's family, his history, and the ties that had been hidden for so long. Emily had often referred to her family as simple, small-town folks. On the surface, that's exactly what they were, a small but happy family, living the suburban dream. But digging deeper, Harlow discovered a family history riddled with unspoken resentments and painful events. There had been stories of estranged relatives, half-siblings, distant cousins, and old feuds that no one talked about in polite company. The deeper Harlow dug, the more he uncovered about Greg's brother, Ethan Bradford. Ethan had been a quiet man, someone who had always lived in the shadow of his more successful brother. He was a man of few words, but Harlow had learned that Ethan's life was anything but ordinary. Ethan had been estranged from the family for nearly a decade, leaving home shortly after a violent fallout with Greg over a business deal gone wrong. The details of the fallout were buried deep, with few willing to talk about it. But there were whispers, and those whispers painted a disturbing picture. Ethan had been involved in a financial scam years ago. He had been arrested once, but the charges were dropped after a murky plea deal. The details of his criminal activities were fuzzy, but the rumor was that he had made enemies, people who could have held grudges. Ethan's sudden disappearance after the scandal had left an indelible mark on the Bradford family. Emily, always the peacekeeper, had tried to keep the family together, but Greg was cold towards Ethan. The timing of Ethan's disappearance, coinciding with the period when Emily had started questioning Greg's involvement with Caleb Dawson, struck Harlow as suspicious. Could Ethan have come back to settle a score? Or, even more terrifying, had he never left at all? Harlow called in Greg's sister, Martha, for questioning. She had been one of the few family members who still kept in contact with Ethan. Martha was known for her open demeanor, the one person who seemed willing to speak the truth, no matter how unpleasant. "I don't know where Ethan is," Martha had said, wiping away the tears from her eyes. "But I can tell you this, he never meant for things to get so bad. He was trying to fix things with Greg, but, well, you know how Greg is." Harlow pressed for more details. "You said he tried to fix things with Greg. What happened exactly?" Martha hesitated. "Ethan came by to talk to Greg a few months ago. He had no idea what he was getting into. Greg had already made his mind up that he'd never forgive him. The whole thing just spiraled out of control." As the investigation progressed, Harlow learned that the rift between the brothers had run deeper than he realized. Greg had accused Ethan of betraying him over a business deal that had left them both financially ruined. It wasn't just money at stake, it was pride, reputation, and trust. And when Ethan had disappeared, Greg had taken control of the family business, leaving Ethan behind. But that didn't explain why Ethan's name kept resurfacing. Harlow discovered an unsettling piece of information. Greg had tried to contact Ethan a few weeks before the fire. The call records had been wiped from Greg's phone, but Martha had managed to remember the date, just days before Emily's death. What was Ethan doing back in town? Had he come back to confront Greg once again? Or was there another reason he reappeared, something darker than the family feud? Late one night, a breakthrough came in the form of a tip-off. An anonymous caller had witnessed an argument between Greg and Ethan the night before the fire. The location? A rundown warehouse on the outskirts of town, one that had been abandoned for years. Harlow gathered his team and set off to investigate. When they arrived at the warehouse, it was eerily quiet, save for the faint rustling of leaves carried by the wind. Harlow and his team scoured the area, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They found evidence of a struggle, a broken bottle, fresh tire tracks, and footprints in the mud. It seemed like Greg and Ethan had met here, alone, away from the prying eyes of the family. But what really stood out was the letter Harlow found, wedged under a metal beam. The handwriting was unmistakable, it was Ethan's. The letter was addressed to Greg, and it spoke of revenge, betrayal, and the desire to settle old scores. The most chilling line, however, read, "If you think you can get away with this, think again. I will make sure you pay for what you've done." Harlow's suspicion grew as he realized the full extent of the tension between the brothers. Ethan had returned to exact revenge, not just for the business betrayal, but for the way Greg had treated him all those years. Harlow didn't know if Ethan had started the fire or if Greg had done it himself, but the emotional weight of their conflict was undeniable. This was personal. It wasn't just about money or betrayal, it was about something deeper. The letter was a direct threat. The fire hadn't just been a means of destruction, it had been a carefully executed message to Greg. The only question that remained was, had Ethan returned from the shadows, or had he somehow orchestrated this from afar? Had he turned his wrath into something far worse than anyone could have imagined? As Harlow put the pieces together, he received another call. This time, the tip came from an unlikely source, Caleb Dawson, the former accomplice of Greg. Caleb had a story to tell, and Harlow was listening. Caleb confessed that he and Greg had planned something together. But Caleb was now certain that Greg had manipulated him into starting the fire for his own personal gain. Caleb had been used. "I didn't know she was going to die," Caleb muttered over the phone, his voice strained. "I was just doing my job." But Greg, he had something else in mind. He didn't want anyone to know what he was really up to. The idea that Caleb and Ethan were involved in this scheme, together, was more than unsettling. It wasn't just a simple case of arson. There were multiple motives at play: revenge, betrayal, and the lengths to which people would go to settle old scores. As the case deepens, we're left with more questions than answers. Was Ethan truly involved, or was he just another pawn in Greg's game? Stay with us, because the plot is about to thicken. Who's telling the truth? And who will pay the ultimate price? Don't forget to subscribe and join us as we uncover the twists and turns of this chilling tale. And tell us, who do you think is responsible for the fire? Let us know in the comments. The deeper the investigation went, the darker the secrets became. Family history, once thought to be long buried, resurfaced in ways that left Detective Harlow shaken. The Bradfords weren't just victims of betrayal, they were a family poisoned by years of resentment, guilt, and an unspoken desire for revenge. In a town full of whispered rumors, the most sinister truth lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be unearthed. The case had taken a strange turn. As Harlow continued his investigation into Greg Bradford and his estranged brother, Ethan, new revelations emerged, truths that threatened to shatter everything Harlow thought he knew about the Bradford family. Emily, once seen as the epitome of kindness and familial stability, had been hiding her own dark secrets. As Harlow sifted through old documents, family records, and testimonies, a disturbing picture began to form, one that painted the Bradfords not as victims, but as people consumed by greed, jealousy, and anger. It was no longer just a case of revenge between brothers, it was a complex web of betrayal, broken dreams, and destructive guilt that ran through generations of the Bradford family. Emily, the apparent victim, had been more than just an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. She had been complicit in the tragic downfall that was about to unfold. Harlow turned to Emily's journals, hoping to piece together her final thoughts, her emotional state before her death. He needed to understand why she had stayed with Greg for so long, knowing about his infidelities, his financial problems, and the growing strain between the family members. One journal entry, dated a week before the fire, sent a chill down his spine. Emily had written about feeling trapped, torn between loyalty to her children and the bitterness she harbored toward her husband. She confessed to having once loved him, but that love had turned to resentment after years of emotional abuse, financial ruin, and her husband's increasingly erratic behavior. But it was another entry, dated just days before her death, that made Harlow pause. It read, "I've tried to keep everything together, for the sake of the children. But Greg, he's slipping away. He's angry at the world, and I don't think he's ever going to change. I think he's hiding something, something that will destroy us all. I can't be silent anymore. If something happens to me, it won't be an accident. It will be him. He's been threatening me, in ways I can't explain." Her words felt like a prophecy, as if Emily had known her fate. She had suspected Greg's involvement in something darker, but she had no proof. Harlow couldn't help but wonder if her death had been planned not just by Greg, but also by someone else. Someone close. As Harlow delved deeper into the Bradfords' past, he uncovered more unsettling facts about the family's history, secrets that had been buried under years of silence. The Bradfords weren't the picture-perfect family they had once seemed. The cracks had been there all along, hidden beneath their polished facades. Greg and Ethan's strained relationship had been exacerbated by a long-standing family feud over money. It was a bitter battle, one that had festered for years. The issue had started with the family business, Bradford and Sons, a once-thriving construction company. Greg had always felt he deserved the lion's share of the profits, while Ethan had been left in the shadows, never fully trusted by his older brother. The disagreement had started small, an argument over the direction of the business, over who had more say in decision-making. But it had spiraled into something much darker. Greg had accused Ethan of being irresponsible, of making poor investments that had cost the company hundreds of thousands. In reality, it was Greg's own financial mismanagement that had placed the company in jeopardy, but he'd always been skilled at covering up his mistakes and blaming others. As tensions grew, so did the bitterness between the brothers. They stopped speaking, and Greg made sure to erase Ethan from every aspect of the company. The final blow came when Greg decided to sell the business off to a competitor, cutting Ethan completely out of the deal. Ethan was left with nothing, no savings, no support, and no family. And that was when Ethan disappeared. Or so everyone thought. Ethan's return to town was more than just an attempt to mend his relationship with his family. He had come back for one thing: revenge. Revenge against the brother who had destroyed his life, and revenge against the family who had abandoned him. But there was something more to it, something darker than a mere vendetta. Harlow uncovered a series of messages between Ethan and Caleb Dawson, the arsonist. The two men had been in contact ever since Ethan's return. Caleb had promised to help Ethan exact his revenge, through fire. Ethan, desperate and consumed with rage, had agreed to the plan. He was willing to go to any lengths to bring his brother down. But it wasn't just about Greg anymore, it was about something much deeper, something Ethan had learned about his own family. In his absence, Ethan had discovered a devastating secret: Greg hadn't been the only one responsible for their downfall. Emily, in her attempt to protect her children and maintain the peace, had made deals with Greg behind Ethan's back. She had agreed to keep quiet about Greg's financial mismanagement, his affairs, and his dangerous behaviors. And that, Ethan believed, was just as much of a betrayal as Greg's actions. Ethan had returned not just to confront Greg, but to confront Emily as well. He wanted to expose everything, to tear down the lies and the masks that had covered the truth for so long. Emily had always been the glue that held the family together, but in the end, she was as complicit as Greg in destroying everything they had once built. On the night of the fire, the stage was set for the final act. Greg and Emily had argued, again. The tension in the house was palpable. Emily had finally decided to leave Greg, to take the children and escape the suffocating grip of his control. She had planned to take the kids and move far away, but Greg wasn't going to let that happen. That night, after the argument, Greg had called Caleb, instructing him to set the fire. But Caleb had an additional motive. He wanted to ensure that Greg would suffer as much as possible. He had planned the fire carefully, making sure it would spread quickly, trapping Emily inside. He had no intention of saving her. He wanted her to pay for her role in the family's destruction. And so, he did his job. But as the flames engulfed the house, Greg found himself in an impossible position. He could have saved Emily, but by then, he was too far gone. The guilt he had carried for years was overwhelming. He had lost control of his life, his family, and his sanity. In that moment, the fire was no longer just about revenge. It was about erasing the last remnants of his shattered life. The investigation into the fire was far from over. As Harlow pieced together the complex narrative, he realized that Greg had been the one to set everything into motion. But Ethan's return, Caleb's involvement, and Emily's quiet complicity in the family's downfall all played a role in the tragic events that unfolded. The question remained, was Greg the only one to blame? Was Ethan's return just another piece of a much larger puzzle, or was it the spark that had lit the fuse? And in the end, who had paid the highest price for all the secrets, lies, and betrayals? The deeper we go, the darker the story becomes. Secrets, lies, and revenge have torn this family apart. But are we truly any closer to the truth? Stay tuned as we continue our investigation into this web of betrayal. Who is truly to blame for the fire that destroyed the Bradfords' lives? Don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts below, because the shocking truth is closer than you think. The fire wasn't just an accident. It was a meticulously planned act of destruction, a burning symbol of betrayal and vengeance. But who had set the flames, and why? As Detective Harlow sifted through the debris of the Bradfords' ruined lives, the true horror behind the fire came into focus. The flames were more than just a weapon, they were a message. But the question remained, who had sent it? The roar of the fire had been deafening, almost as though the house itself was alive, screaming in its final moments. Harlow had seen fires before, but nothing like this. The fire had consumed everything, no sign of the victims, no clear cause of the blaze, just the remains of what had once been a home. The devastation was nearly absolute. Nothing seemed to make sense. How could something so violent, so carefully executed, be the result of an accident? This fire wasn't a random tragedy, it was the product of deliberate intent. But who was the mastermind? Greg Bradford, his wife Emily, or someone else entirely? The first responders had been quick, but not quick enough. By the time the fire had been brought under control, the house was reduced to a skeletal framework, its once proud walls now hollowed out by the flames. No one had been able to make sense of it at first, and for a few moments, it seemed like an ordinary fire. But as the investigation went deeper, the truth began to emerge. The patterns of the burn marks told a story of their own. A careful, deliberate story. It wasn't random, it was strategic. The fire had been set in multiple places at once, near the kitchen, in the hallway, and near the stairs. The aim had been clear, to ensure that the fire would spread quickly, trapping anyone inside, leaving no chance of escape. This wasn't an accidental blaze started by a stray ember or a faulty appliance. The fire had been carefully planned, down to the smallest detail. The burn marks were unmistakable. The heat signature of the fire was even more telling, an unnatural intensity, especially near the kitchen, where Emily's body had been found. Harlow knew that this wasn't an ordinary fire. Someone had used accelerants to increase the fire's spread. Gasoline, perhaps. Or maybe something stronger. As Harlow reviewed the forensic reports, his mind raced. He had to consider one thing: who stood to gain from such an act? Who would benefit from Emily's death? From the destruction of the Bradford home? Greg had been the prime suspect from the start. The pieces seemed to fall into place with terrifying precision: Greg's financial difficulties, his troubled relationship with Emily, his growing desperation to hold onto the family business. But there was something about the fire that didn't sit right with Harlow. It was too calculated, too methodical. Greg, in his fragile emotional state, had been a man on the edge. It was clear to Harlow that Greg had the motive. He had been on the brink of losing everything. His wife, his children, the business. His pride was shattered, his reputation in tatters. But was he capable of planning and executing such a horrific act? Harlow wasn't so sure. And then, there was the matter of the gasoline. Greg didn't have the experience or knowledge to set such a sophisticated fire, not to the extent it had been done. Harlow's gut told him that someone else was involved. Someone who had the means, the expertise, and the motive to see this through to its bitter end. Caleb Dawson's name had come up several times in the investigation, but only in passing. He was the former accomplice of Greg Bradford, the one who had been involved in several small arson jobs for money. But Caleb was no stranger to fire. He had been trained, through experience, on how to use fire as a weapon. In fact, Caleb had set numerous fires in the past, usually for insurance money. But now, things had escalated. Harlow's investigation turned back to Caleb's relationship with Greg. Caleb had been involved with Greg for years, but it was only after Ethan Bradford's reappearance in town that things began to spiral out of control. Caleb had his own reasons for wanting to see the Bradfords suffer. He resented Greg's success, his power, and his control over their shared history. Caleb was the kind of man who wanted revenge, but his form of vengeance was crueler than anyone could imagine. Greg, it seemed, had called Caleb that fateful night, the night of the fire. Their final conversation was one Harlow would never forget. Caleb had admitted to being the one who had set the fire, but there was something strange in his voice, an admission of guilt mixed with a sense of satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. "I did it for you, Greg," Caleb had said, his voice tinged with a mix of contempt and pity. "You've always been a coward. Always trying to keep your family under control, always playing the martyr. It was time for the world to see the real you." Caleb had set the fire, but he hadn't done it for money. He hadn't done it just to hurt Emily. No, this had been a personal vendetta. It had been about tearing down everything Greg Bradford had built, everything that Emily had fought to protect. The fire had burned away more than just the Bradford home. It had burned away the facade of a family that had once seemed so perfect, so untouchable. As Harlow investigated further, he uncovered even more disturbing truths. Greg's relationship with Caleb had been much more complicated than anyone had realized. It wasn't just business, it was personal. Greg had trusted Caleb once, but Caleb had always held a grudge. There had been countless times when Greg had promised to make Caleb a partner in the family business, only to pull back at the last minute. Caleb had been promised the world, but all he had gotten was a shattered dream. And that dream had turned into a nightmare. Caleb's resentment had festered over the years, until it boiled over into something far worse than anyone could have anticipated. When Greg called him that night, Caleb saw it as his chance to strike back. To make Greg suffer the way he had suffered. To tear apart everything Greg had ever cared about. And so, Caleb set the fire. But what Caleb hadn't anticipated was Emily's sacrifice. She hadn't just been a victim of the fire, she had been a willing participant in the destruction. Emily had known her husband was on the verge of losing everything. She had known that the family was crumbling, but she had never expected things to spiral this far out of control. She had tried to intervene, but it was too late. The fire had consumed her. The night before the fire, there had been a confrontation. Greg and Emily had fought one final time. Emily, fed up with Greg's emotional abuse and reckless behavior, had told him she was leaving. She had planned to take the children and leave the town behind. It was the last straw, the final attempt to escape the suffocating grip of her husband's control. But Greg, desperate to keep his family together at any cost, couldn't allow it. In that moment, he made the decision that would forever change their lives. He had called Caleb. "I can't lose everything," Greg had pleaded, his voice shaking with fear. "You have to do it. Set the fire. Burn it all." Caleb had agreed. By the time Harlow had pieced everything together, the full extent of the tragedy became clear. Caleb Dawson had been the one to set the fire, but it had been Greg's call. Greg had wanted to destroy everything, his wife, his children, the life he had built. He had made the ultimate sacrifice to ensure that Emily could never escape him. But the fire had taken on a life of its own. Emily had died, trapped in the inferno, but not before making one final choice, one final stand. She had tried to save her children, but the flames had overtaken her before she could escape. A fire started with vengeance and betrayal, two men, each driven by rage, each willing to burn everything to the ground. But as the investigation continues, we are left with one final question: who is truly responsible for this tragedy? Stay with us, because the truth is more shocking than you could ever imagine. Don't forget to subscribe and join us as we unravel the final pieces of this devastating puzzle. Who will pay for this fire? The investigation into the fire has taken unexpected twists, but a breakthrough revelation threatens to turn everything upside down. The seemingly straightforward case has turned into a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and hidden truths. As Detective Harlow digs deeper, new leads surface, each one more shocking than the last. Someone is hiding the truth, and the closer Harlow gets to the heart of the mystery, the more dangerous the journey becomes. Detective Harlow sat in his office, the weight of the case settling heavily on his shoulders. Every lead had pointed back to Greg Bradford, but the deeper he dug, the more questions emerged. Caleb Dawson was the clear arsonist, but Harlow couldn't shake the feeling that something was being kept from him. There was too much at stake, too many inconsistencies, too many tangled relationships. He had made significant progress, but the truth still eluded him. The investigation into the fire had shifted from a straightforward case of arson to something far more complex. Caleb Dawson had confessed to setting the fire, but his motivations were unclear. It seemed like the fire was just the tip of the iceberg, a means to an end, but not the end itself. The destruction of the Bradford family was about more than just revenge or financial ruin. The more Harlow learned about Greg's history, the more he realized that this tragedy had been years in the making. As Harlow reviewed the evidence once more, a breakthrough came. A new lead, an anonymous tip-off, had surfaced, suggesting that there were hidden ties between Greg and someone much more dangerous than Caleb. Someone with a deep knowledge of fire and destruction, someone who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The tip led Harlow to a man named Victor Barnes. Barnes was a name Harlow had heard whispered in passing during his early days in law enforcement, but he had never thought much of it. Victor Barnes was a local contractor, a man who had been involved in several shady dealings throughout the years. Harlow had been warned about him before. Rumors swirled that Barnes was a man who didn't shy away from violence when it suited him. But Harlow was now convinced that Victor Barnes had been playing a role far larger than anyone could have guessed. Barnes had been in contact with Greg Bradford just days before the fire, and it seemed that their relationship had been more than just business. Harlow dug deeper into Barnes's past, and what he found chilled him to the core. Victor Barnes wasn't just a contractor. He was also a skilled arsonist, one who had been responsible for multiple fires over the years. His methods were highly sophisticated, an expert at controlling and manipulating fire to achieve specific outcomes. Barnes had been hired by several wealthy individuals over the years to destroy property for profit, to eliminate competition, or to cover up scandals. He had made a living out of setting fires, and it seemed that Greg Bradford had come to him with a job that involved more than just burning down a house. Barnes's connection to Caleb Dawson made sense now. Caleb had been the one to set the fire, but he wasn't acting alone. He had been working for someone much more dangerous. Someone who had orchestrated the entire plan, pulling the strings from the shadows. That person had been Victor Barnes. Harlow's heart pounded as he pieced together the timeline. Greg Bradford had contacted Barnes first, asking him to destroy his wife, his family, his life. He had asked Barnes to create the perfect fire, one that would ensure Emily's death and erase the remnants of their fractured family. But Barnes hadn't stopped there. He had manipulated Caleb into doing the dirty work, using him as a pawn in a much larger game. Caleb was the tool, but Barnes was the architect. And the true motive behind the fire wasn't just about Greg's financial ruin, it was about wiping the slate clean, about destroying everything in his path to rebuild from the ashes. Harlow spent the next few days tracking down Victor Barnes, following his every move, trying to find the link that would tie him directly to the fire. Barnes was no stranger to manipulation, and he had managed to cover his tracks well. But Harlow was relentless. He traced Barnes's steps to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place where he often worked on jobs with Caleb and other criminals. When Harlow and his team arrived, they found the warehouse empty. But there were signs of recent activity, burnt papers, blackened tools, and charred remnants that told a disturbing story. It was clear that Barnes had been here recently, perhaps preparing for the next stage of his plan. As Harlow scoured the warehouse, he found something he hadn't expected, a collection of old photographs. The pictures were of Greg Bradford, Caleb Dawson, and Victor Barnes, all together in what appeared to be a series of meetings. Harlow knew immediately that these men had been collaborating for much longer than he had realized. This wasn't just a spontaneous act of arson, it was a carefully planned scheme, one that had been years in the making. The photographs showed the three men in various locations, at the Bradford family business, at Caleb's apartment, and at Victor's warehouse. But it was the final photo that caught Harlow's attention. It was a picture of the three men standing in front of the Bradford family home, the very house that would later burn to the ground. It was clear now, this fire had been no accident. It had been a carefully orchestrated act of revenge, carried out by a group of men who had been plotting for years. Greg had been the one to hire Victor Barnes, but it was Barnes who had taken control of the situation, manipulating everyone involved. The fire had been just the beginning of a much larger plan, one that would tear apart the Bradford family forever. As Harlow reflected on the case, the true motive behind the fire began to take shape. It wasn't just about financial ruin or revenge, it was about power and control. Greg Bradford had always been a man obsessed with power. His need to control everything in his life had driven him to manipulate, betray, and destroy anyone who stood in his way. But his obsession had blinded him to the consequences of his actions. Victor Barnes had recognized this weakness in Greg. He had seen an opportunity to use Greg's desperation to his advantage. Barnes had given Greg what he wanted: destruction, chaos, and the chance to start over. But in doing so, Barnes had manipulated Greg into sacrificing everything: his wife, his children, his future. Harlow knew that Greg had paid a steep price for his actions. Emily was gone, and the children were now left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. But the real tragedy wasn't just in the loss of a family, it was in the realization that Greg's desire for control had led to his own undoing. He had been used by Victor Barnes, manipulated into believing that he could rebuild from the ashes, only to find that there was nothing left to rebuild. The investigation had finally reached its conclusion. With the evidence in hand, Harlow was able to make the arrests: Greg Bradford, Caleb Dawson, and Victor Barnes. The three men were taken into custody, each one facing charges of arson, conspiracy to commit murder, and the destruction of the Bradford family. But even as Harlow made the arrests, a sense of unease lingered. The damage had already been done. The fire had consumed more than just a home, it had destroyed the lives of everyone involved. And the real question now was, would justice be enough to repair the broken pieces of a family torn apart by greed, betrayal, and revenge? After all the lies, the manipulation, and the destruction, the truth has finally come to light. But can the damage ever truly be undone? The Bradfords are left to pick up the pieces, and the killers are behind bars, but the scars will remain forever. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the shocking details of this tragedy. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below. What do you think the real cost of revenge is? Just when it seemed like the investigation had uncovered all the answers, a twist came that no one saw coming. A hidden truth, buried beneath layers of deception, threatens to change everything Detective Harlow thought he knew. The pieces of the puzzle fit together in a way that left Harlow questioning everything. Who were the real victims? And who had masterminded the entire tragedy? The arrests of Greg Bradford, Caleb Dawson, and Victor Barnes had been a moment of relief for Detective Harlow. After months of painstaking investigation, the key players behind the fire had been apprehended. The case seemed to be wrapping up neatly, almost too neatly. But as Harlow sat in his office, going over the final reports and preparing for the trial, an unsettling feeling gnawed at him. There was still something off. Something about the case didn't sit right. The motivation seemed too clear, too simple. Caleb had set the fire, Greg had hired him, and Victor had masterminded the whole thing. The twisted revenge, the personal vendettas, the financial ruin, it all made sense, but it didn't fully explain the destruction that had been wrought. Harlow sat back in his chair and stared at the evidence board on the wall. There was one name that had haunted him throughout the investigation: Ethan Bradford. Ethan had always been the missing piece, the wild card that no one could fully account for. He had disappeared years ago, only to return just weeks before the fire, adding an unpredictable element to the already volatile mix of Greg and his enemies. What if Ethan wasn't just a bystander in this story? What if he had a far greater role to play than anyone realized? The breakthrough came unexpectedly, during a routine follow-up investigation. A source, someone who had been close to Ethan in the past, came forward with new information. The source, a former colleague of Ethan's at a local construction site, revealed something chilling: a meeting that had taken place in the days before the fire. The witness described a heated conversation between Ethan and Victor Barnes at a bar in town. It was the same night that Greg had called Caleb to set the fire. The conversation between Ethan and Victor had been brief but intense, and the witness overheard a few snippets of their exchange. "I've given you everything you need," Ethan had said, his voice tense. "Greg deserves to burn for what he's done. But we need to make sure he knows that this is just the beginning." The witness had not realized the full implication of what he had overheard at the time, but as Harlow heard these details, everything clicked into place. Ethan hadn't just come back to town to settle old scores with his brother. He had returned with a plan that involved not just burning Greg's life to the ground, but destroying everything that Greg had built, including his wife and children. Harlow had always believed that Greg was the mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the fire in a fit of desperation. But now, it seemed like Greg wasn't the one pulling all the strings. Ethan had been the true architect of the entire tragedy. Ethan had used Greg, Caleb, and Victor to execute a plan of absolute destruction, a plan that would erase the Bradfords once and for all. Harlow dug deeper into Ethan's past, uncovering startling truths that no one had anticipated. Ethan's life hadn't been just a series of unfortunate events, it had been carefully planned from the beginning. After he had been cast out of the family, Ethan had started over, building his own empire in the shadows. He had worked his way into the criminal underworld, making deals with dangerous people who specialized in arson, theft, and sabotage. But his return to town wasn't just about reconciling with his family. It was about a much darker goal, vengeance. Ethan had never forgiven Greg for ruining his life. The betrayal, the lies, the loss of everything he had worked for, it had eaten away at Ethan for years. And when he had learned about Greg's mounting financial troubles and personal failures, he saw his opportunity for revenge. He wasn't interested in just humiliating Greg, he wanted to destroy him completely. And he had planned every detail. What Harlow had missed in the early stages of the investigation was Ethan's role in manipulating the people around him. He hadn't simply been an innocent bystander who had been wronged. He had been the puppet master, orchestrating every move from behind the scenes, using Greg's desperation and Caleb's need for revenge to his advantage. Ethan had reached out to Victor Barnes, knowing that Barnes had the skills and resources to carry out the fire. But it was Ethan who had been the one to push Greg into taking the final steps. He had manipulated Greg into thinking that the only way to fix things was through destruction, that he needed to burn down his old life to start fresh. But it wasn't just about Greg's life. It was about taking everything down with him, his wife, his children, his home. As Harlow continued to dig into Ethan's past, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. Ethan had been keeping tabs on Greg and Emily for months before the fire. He had known about their struggles, their fights, and their fragile family dynamic. But more than that, he had known about Emily's journal, the one in which she had written about Greg's increasing erratic behavior. Ethan had read it, he had studied it in detail. And that was when Harlow understood the true nature of Ethan's plan. He had wanted to destroy Emily's faith in Greg, to push her to the breaking point so that she would leave him. But it wasn't just about breaking up the family. Ethan had seen Emily as an obstacle. In his mind, she was just another barrier that needed to be removed. Ethan's final move had been to orchestrate the fire in such a way that Emily would be trapped inside, unable to escape. He had made sure the fire spread quickly, ensuring that there would be no chance for her to survive. It was the ultimate betrayal, not just of Greg, but of the family he had once been a part of. The truth hit Harlow like a ton of bricks. Ethan hadn't just wanted revenge on Greg. He had wanted to destroy everything that Greg had built, to erase his legacy and make sure that the Bradfords would never be whole again. And the fire had been the final act in a long, calculated campaign of revenge. It was no longer just a story of a troubled family. It was a story of manipulation, betrayal, and destruction on an unimaginable scale. Ethan had turned his own family into pawns in his game of revenge, using their weaknesses and vulnerabilities to tear them apart. And in the end, it wasn't just Greg who had been destroyed, it was the entire Bradford family. With this newfound knowledge, Harlow was able to arrest Ethan Bradford. The investigation that had seemed so straightforward was now revealed to be an elaborate scheme, one that had been carefully planned and executed by the very person who had once been a victim. Ethan was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and multiple counts of fraud and manipulation. As Harlow sat in the interrogation room, watching Ethan's cold, unflinching gaze, he couldn't help but wonder what had driven this man to such extremes. Ethan's response was chillingly simple. "I didn't just want to destroy Greg. I wanted to make sure he knew exactly what it felt like to lose everything. To feel the way I felt all those years." The case had come full circle. What had started as a fire had revealed a deeper, darker truth about the Bradford family, a truth that no one could have imagined. The fire that was supposed to destroy a family ended up exposing the deepest, darkest secrets of all. But in the end, who paid the highest price? Was it the victims, or was it the one who sought to destroy everything? The investigation may be over, but the truth will continue to haunt those who were left behind. Stay tuned for the final chapter of this shocking tale, subscribe, and leave your thoughts below. What would you do if you were betrayed by your own family? And the twisted saga of the Bradford family had arrived. After months of deception, betrayal, and fire, the truth had been uncovered, but the consequences were far from over. Detective Harlow stood at the crossroads of justice and tragedy, watching as the lives of the Bradford family were irreparably changed. But as the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, one question lingered. Was the truth enough to heal the wounds that had been inflicted? Or was the damage already too deep to repair? The weight of the investigation had taken its toll on Detective Harlow. He had spent months sifting through the wreckage of the Bradford family's tragic end, piecing together the twisted plot that had led to the fire. The arrests of Greg, Caleb, Victor, and Ethan had seemed like the final resolution. Justice served, the criminals taken off the streets. But in the aftermath of it all, Harlow couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. The truth had been revealed, but the cost had been immense. Emily was gone, and the children were left to grapple with the trauma of losing their mother and, in a sense, their father. Greg had been in prison, but his life would never be the same. The fire, which had once seemed like an act of desperation, had turned into something far more sinister, a calculated attempt to destroy an entire family. As Harlow stood in the courtroom, watching as Ethan Bradford was led in for his final hearing, he couldn't help but reflect on the lives that had been shattered. The trial would be a long and arduous process, but for now, the truth had been laid bare. Ethan had orchestrated the entire tragedy, using his family as pawns in his game of revenge. But the question that still haunted Harlow was whether the justice system could truly bring closure to a crime as deep and destructive as this. Ethan Bradford's arrest had been the turning point in the investigation. When Harlow had finally connected the dots, it had been like a burst of clarity. Ethan had been the mastermind behind the entire plot. It wasn't just a case of a troubled family falling apart, it was the result of years of pent-up anger, resentment, and manipulation. Ethan had returned to town not to reconcile with his family, but to destroy them, every last one of them. He had used Caleb and Victor to do his bidding, playing on their weaknesses and exploiting their thirst for revenge. Caleb had been an easy pawn, eager to exact his own twisted form of justice, while Victor Barnes had used his skills as an arsonist to carry out the perfect crime. But the twist in the case came when Harlow discovered the true extent of Ethan's involvement. It wasn't just about Greg. Ethan had manipulated everyone around him, even Emily. She had been caught in the crossfire of a scheme that had been years in the making. And in the end, she had paid the ultimate price for her husband's sins, and for the sins of her own family. The arrests of Greg, Caleb, and Victor were difficult to stomach, but the true shock came when Ethan was finally taken into custody. He had always seemed like the black sheep of the family, the one who had been cast out and forgotten. But in reality, he had been the puppet master all along. His calm demeanor in the face of arrest only added to the chilling nature of his actions. Ethan wasn't just a victim of his circumstances, he had been the instigator, the architect of the destruction that had torn his family apart. As the dust settled, the consequences of the fire rippled through the community. The town had been shocked by the tragedy, and the Bradfords had once been a symbol of success and stability. Now, they were a cautionary tale, a family torn apart by greed, revenge, and the need for control. Emily's death had left a void that could never be filled, and the children, now orphans, would carry the scars of the fire with them for the rest of their lives. Greg, once a proud businessman, now sat in a prison cell, facing charges of conspiracy, murder, and arson. His reputation had been destroyed, and his wealth and power were now meaningless. He had been a man consumed by his own arrogance, willing to sacrifice everything for the sake of control. But in the end, it had cost him his family, his freedom, and his dignity. Caleb Dawson, the former arsonist who had been manipulated into setting the fire, was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. He had been used as a tool in Ethan's game, but his role in the destruction was undeniable. Caleb had known the consequences of his actions, but he had been too blinded by his own thirst for revenge to see the damage he was causing. Victor Barnes, the man who had expertly executed the plan, was also taken into custody. His skills as an arsonist had been instrumental in carrying out the fire, and he faced charges of murder and arson. But even as he was led away, he maintained a cold indifference, as though the destruction he had caused was of no consequence to him. And then there was Ethan, the mastermind, the puppet master. His arrest marked the end of a long and painful journey for Detective Harlow, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Bradford family. Ethan was charged with multiple counts of murder, arson, and conspiracy. His trial was set to begin, and Harlow knew that it would be a long and painful process. But the real tragedy, Harlow realized, wasn't in the arrests or the legal proceedings. The real tragedy was the destruction of a family that had once been whole, united by love and shared history. Now, there was nothing left but ash and rubble. As the trial progressed, Harlow kept in contact with the remaining members of the Bradford family, Greg's children. They were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life, forced to navigate a world where their mother was gone and their father was behind bars. Emily's death had left a gaping hole in their lives, one that would never be filled. The children, now under the care of distant relatives, faced an uncertain future. Their lives had been turned upside down, and the trauma of losing both parents, one through death, the other through imprisonment, was something they would carry with them forever. Harlow visited them on occasion, trying to offer words of comfort. But there was little he could say that would heal the pain. The fire that had claimed their mother had also taken their innocence. They had been forced to grow up too quickly, to face a reality that no child should ever have to endure. But even as they faced an uncertain future, Harlow couldn't help but wonder, would justice be enough to heal their wounds? Could the legal system ever truly provide closure for a crime as deep and tragic as this? The answer, he knew, would never come easily. As the case reached its conclusion, Harlow couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost in the process. Justice had been served, but the price had been high. The fire that had started as an act of destruction had now become a symbol of the breakdown of a family, a town, and a community. The Bradfords had been victims of their own secrets, their own lies, and their own thirst for control. In the end, the fire had destroyed not just their home, but everything they had ever known. And for what? A chance at redemption? A quest for power? Revenge? The answers didn't seem to matter anymore. Harlow stood in front of the courtroom, watching as Ethan was led away in handcuffs. The case was over, but the damage would remain long after the final verdict was read. The Bradford story had come to an end, but the consequences of their actions would echo through the generations to come. And so, justice has been served. But can anyone truly recover from the devastation that was left behind? The fire that claimed so much was more than just an act of destruction. It was the unraveling of a family. The truth has been revealed, but the scars will remain. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the deepest, darkest stories of crime and betrayal. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your thoughts below. What do you think the true cost of revenge really is?